more of a culturally subversive model for what I surmise we really want. To put on display before the world that the gospel makes a profound difference in the nature of our relationships and how we form and shape community and how we form and shape the church. If we look at race discussions in recent history, for those of us born after the Civil Rights Movement, this discussion is not nearly as personal. For my parents, my mom was born in 1943, my dad in 1938, their discussion about race and justice and that history is very different from mine as a Gen Xer who was raised in the 1970s, this sort of second wave of African Americans in the Atlanta area who actually went to multi-racial schools. And so my understanding, my framework with respect to these questions is very, very different from my parents. And my little brother, who is on the front end of the Gen X generation, has even more of a different understanding of what these issues are, because in his generation, having grown up in the 80s and 90s, his experience with race was completely different. So how do we conceptualize categories and concepts that really span the generations and actually encourage us to think more broadly about the implications of some of these matters? So at least for myself and for my brother and for example, my niece, who recently born a few years ago, this discussion may not be so much about past oppression, current pain, and tensions and grievances, but moving forward, thinking about the ways in which you put the gospel on display in a platform of solidarity like we see in the church in Galatia. So what is racial solidarity? Well, two of my heroes who promoted racial reconciliation after the Civil Rights Movement are J. Diotis Roberts and John M. Perkins. Now, in different ways, both of these men wanted to see the Church of Jesus Christ provide a post-civil rights era image of racial unity and peace. While there has been much progress, many of their dreams have yet to come true. And I'm convinced that the church will not be able to lead society on race unless it moves beyond the discourse about reconciliation and pursues racial solidarity, which means embracing our common human dignity as a human family in ways that celebrate and respect differences between ethnic communities for the common good. This is beyond the failed concept of color blindness and recognizes the importance of racial, ethnic, and ideological differences as a catalyst for loving one's neighbor and loving one's neighbor well. So my emphasis is going to be, in this understanding, Galatians 3, Matthew 22, 36 and 40, where Jesus encourages his disciples to love their neighbor. This emphasis also comes out of John 17, this high priestly prayer where Jesus prays for unity. So where do I get this from? Well, there's a theologian named Herman who makes this very provocative point about the image of God that I think many of us miss in these conversations. While it's true that any one person, me or you, are made in the image of God, that's actually not enough. This is what Herman says. Not the man alone, not the man and the woman together, but the whole of humanity is the fully developed image of God. His children, his offspring. The image of God is much too rich for it to be fully realized in a single human being. However richly gifted that individual may be, it can only be somewhat unfolded in its depth and riches in a humanity whose members exist both successively one after another, and contemporaneously, side by side. So the issue is not that I'm made in the image of God and that any one of you individually is made in the image of God, but that the image of God is us. It is we. It is actually the whole humanity of God that defines what the image of God is. And so the question is, what's preventing us, the we, from uniting together and putting the image of God on display as God so intends? So while it's true that, yes, I'm made in the image of God and any one of you are, that's just a small point, if not the smallest point of this teaching. That what the true force of what is known as the Imago Dei is, in fact, that the whole human family is the image of God. Because God's too big. God is much too rich to have it reduced to any single individual. So as we think about the whole human family as the image of God, we're asking questions about what gets in the way of those things. So I surmise, I would like to submit to you that one of the reasons that the dreams of J.G. Otis Roberts and some of the dreams of John and Perkins have not come true in the ways in which they envision is in part because we're not using the right categories. We're not using categories that are expansive enough or broad enough, or that we are reading things into the text and relying on principles in the text to do the heavy lifting on these issues that those texts were never intended to do. For example, we're using the wrong passages. 2 Corinthians 5, verses 8 and following, about this language about reconciliation is the wrong verse. Here's why. The Greek, katalasso, which is used in Corinthians and in Ephesians, and the Greek, ape, katalasso, which is used in Philippians and Colossians. The Greek usage of that word is never, ever used in the New Testament to talk about the relationship between people. Ever. And so whenever I hear this language of people drawing from the text that we should be about the business of reconciliation because God is reconciling all things to Christ, or that we have a ministry of reconciliation, that's true, but the force of that Greek, the force of all of those texts, is about us being about the business of reconciling people to God. That's what those Greek texts are actually about. So if you want to talk about racial solidarity moving forward, my first principle is, well, let's actually rightly interpret the Bible. Step one. Let's take the Greek text, examine it, and rightly apply it. So here we are with this problem, right? We have these ideas, we have these problems, we have this emphasis, and I believe that this understanding of the Imago Dei broadly as a human family, this understanding of what was up in the Galatian church in chapter 3, this emphasis on loving your neighbor, this emphasis on unity, are actually far more forceful categories to think about this issue redemptive historically. That we think about it within the context of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. It broadens out, I believe, some of the ways in which this language, these concepts, these principles, not only affect the ways in which we think about the church, but the ways in which we think about the world, the ways in which we think about society, the ways in which we think about issues locally. So reconciliation as a concept, as a biblical concept, was not intended to do the heavy lifting for issues like this. Rather, these other issues like loving one's neighbor, unity under the cross, understanding the breadth of the Imago Dei actually help us along in thinking differently, more pervasively, more culturally subversively even, about how to achieve the things that I believe Yotis Roberts and Dr. Perkins sought to launch in the early 1970s. One other issue, of course, is and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is dealing with the issue of white privilege. My experience has been that in reconciliation discourse, there hasn't been enough interrogation of what white privilege is and how we negotiate ourselves around it. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh defined it this way. This has been a pretty standard definition of what it is. We introduced it last night, this idea of a right, advantage, or immunity granted or enjoyed by white persons beyond the common advantages of all others. But there's this other emphasis, which I think is actually more the burden for our discussions moving forward. It's not simply the advantage issue, but it's the exemption of particular burdens and liabilities. Freedom from having to think about certain things. So my colleagues and I, when I walk into a classroom of all white people as a black male, I have additional things to think about that my colleagues don't have to actually think about. Okay? And so if we want to deeply interrogate a white privilege, we have to think about it in terms of what's preventing us from fully expressing this Imago Dei, from fully expressing what prevents us, what prevents us from having the kind of unity that shows the world what it means for the people of God to reflect His image together. So what I've been talking about around the country is thinking about white privilege as a fact. And the issue is not to simply have discussions about how to dismantle it, how to subvert it, but how do we actually help people who have it use it for the good? So if you have white privilege, and you do, how do you use it for the good, for the common good, for helping someone else? So, for example, if I had a friend who was a white privileged attorney here in Jackson, Mississippi, I would probably encourage my friend to use his privilege to help some people who can't get appropriate legal counsel. Use his networks, right? Use his friends, use his firm, use the partners. Okay? If you have white privilege, go ahead and own it, and then use it to help somebody else. Okay? I've seen this done in India with respect to rescuing little girls from sex slavery, rescuing whole families from bonded labor slavery. When an American attorney walks into a courtroom, walks into a police department office in any part of India, everybody sits up straight and takes it seriously. And these American attorneys know this. And so they actually use their whiteness for the sake of increasing social justice in India. They're using their privilege for the common good. So I think in some respects we can help this discourse by not having people feel guilty about privilege, but releasing them to use their privilege for the benefit of others. There is, of course, other types of privilege as well, like class, that we should discuss as well. We can discuss as well. We also need to have conversations about what does it mean for the majority culture to submit to the leadership and authority of minorities. We can talk a lot about sort of racial diversity, but how do we engage diverse leadership structures whereby men and women of color are in positions of leadership and discipleship for those who are in the majority culture. What I've seen in some respects is the racial reconciliation discourse not press that point quite far enough. I won't have time to explain it all today, but it's not necessarily the case, and this was brought up last night by Helm, that homogenous churches are all bad. And there's some people that argue in the reconciliation community that all churches should be that should represent Revelation, chapter 7 and chapter 9. I'm going to argue that that's not necessarily the case, and I hide behind Tim Keller to do that, because no one ever disagrees with what Tim Keller ever says. So there is a video clip that I posted before where Tim Keller makes an argument for why ethnic churches are good and needed, why homogenous churches are good and needed as cultural centers to help minorities deal with and live in a world where they are in a subordinate position. One other issue that needs to be addressed is Gordon Alpor's 1954 contact hypothesis. And this challenges the idea that because we have multiple races in a room together, that we've actually made progress. Thomas Sowell talks about this myth of believing that we've made progress because we've decorated institutions like who might decorate a Christmas tree. Right? We've just put racial ornaments in a building and said, hey, we're done. And in 1954, and this is one of the reasons I encourage my friends to read outside of their discipline, to read some sociology every now and then. Gordon Alpor's 1954 contact hypothesis says this: just because people are in a room together with respect to different racial groups doesn't mean that we're making any progress. So he says, as a result, many believe the myth that because multiple races share physical space, that this changes attitudes. He's going to challenge that. This is 1954. Alpor's criteria demonstrate that racial attitudes change under particular conditions. Number one, when races have equal status, when they have common goals, when there is acquaintance potential, so that's real relationship, real intimacy, and when they have the shared support of authorities and customs. And these conditions have developed and have been empirically tested over years, but you find it rare, I found it rare, that evangelicals talk about equal status, common goals, acquaintance potential, and support of authorities and customs. One additional issue moving forward in the context of racial solidarity is developing leaders who are not primarily white males, and thinking about the implications of that. If I can plug a book I have coming out in May entitled Aliens in the Promised Land, Why White Churches and Institutions Overlook Minorities for Leadership. I've gathered together some Asian American, Hispanic, and African American leaders to discuss why it is that white denominations and institutions, churches, church planting networks, colleges, seminaries, etc., do not have blacks in leadership positions. And to think about what it means moving forward in this particular discourse and conversation with respect to what that is, what that can mean. And it's broad, right? I've got folks from Howard University, I've got Lance Lewis, PCA, I've got in the books some folks from Fuller, Asian Americans from Regent, to really discuss more broadly two things: their experience, because most of them are 20 years older than me, their experience in evangelicalism, and then secondly, their proposals for what needs to happen moving forward to open out this leadership issue beyond simply putting people in a room together. So today, as we continue to discuss, I'm looking forward to thinking more broadly about solidarity, more broadly about human dignity with respect to God fashioning, as Herman Bavinck says, the image of God and expressing that in usness, and thinking about the kingdom, thinking about how Jesus, his burden for us is to be unified so that we begin to display the sorts of things that we saw in Galatia. Now, solidarity, of course, includes dealing with past issues. So that's the racial reconciliation stuff. But it also includes dealing with issues of social structures, social injustice, the ways in which churches are working together, the ways in which people might not have past tension, but they may just be ignorant. They may just be underexposed to different kinds of people, and that introduces new problems. So whatever prevents us from having the type of unity that expresses the full image of God, that's what we need to talk about. And that includes a whole host of things, right? It includes gospel transformation. It includes past racial tension. It includes present racial tension. It includes stereotyping. It includes race and gender and class. All of it is included because those things impede us doing what God intends for us to do with respect to putting His glorious image on display through His people. So, at least in my estimation, this is the direction moving forward that I would like for some of these discussions to go. Why I've chosen racial solidarity as a more expansive category than racial reconciliation, to help some of my younger brothers and sisters for whom they're wondering why they need to reconcile when they had no past tension. For them to think about, well, even though you had no past tension, you weren't there's still some things that are preventing us from loving each other and preventing us from being unified, as we see in John 17. There's things that are preventing us from calling each other brother and sister. Tracking? All right, great. I do that with my students.